I want to just kick off and we'll get into more of the meat of the conversation. Um, and well, there's a little bit of, oh, that's better. Yeah, there's a little bit of background noise. Um, Will wanted to kick off just by having our guest today, April, introduce herself. I want to give a little bit of an introduction. For those of you who don't know, April has become one of my favorite people I've gotten to meet in the past few years, starting Pond, and is an amazing writer and speaker around racial equity focused in philanthropy and nonprofit work. And she's joining us here today to talk about naming and addressing white supremacy in philanthropy. April's also done some work for Pond directly and is just an amazing leader in this space. So if you do have specific projects or follow-up questions, she's an amazing one to work with, although she did want me to caveat that her backlog is a little full, so be patient with her. But if you have the chance to work with her, you'd be really lucky to do so. Without further ado, April, would you mind just introducing yourself, sharing kind of who you are, what you do for your work now, and a few layers of your identity that are most important to you?
Gladly, and hopefully as I'm talking, the background noise won't be quite as loud. I'll hold the mic as close as possible, just let me know. But again, still April Walker, happy to be here. I am born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland, but I've been residing in the Midwest for the past 10 years or so, and I've worked in philanthropy for all of that time in various grant-making, fundraising, or consulting positions. I am probably a recovering, I would say, chief development officer. Lots of stories and experiences as a result of leading a development fundraising team at a nonprofit here in Cleveland, Ohio, that led me to ultimately open my own practice so that I could center equity and liberation and Black joy and philanthropy and really have the conversations that matter to me and that I believe matter to the people being served. And in that vein, I identify as a Black woman, a very proud Black woman, happen to be a member of the African diaspora, and I happen to reside in America as a result of colonization and a certain transatlantic slave trade. So that's who I am, that's how I show up, and again, happy to be here. Thanks, Mitch.
And April, I thank you for the introduction, and I'd love to just dig a little bit deeper for everyone before we get into the conversation. What drew you to nonprofit work in the first place? Like, when did that love story for you with having an impact and helping others start?
Yeah, I would say I have a love story really with impact, but also with Black people. I've spent most of my academic and professional career inside of predominantly white institutions. And so a lot of my work in the nonprofit space has been to create opportunities for the younger me, so to be who I would have needed when I was younger. But also I've seen how ill-equipped the people who were tasked with educating me were to do that job. And so I don't want to leave folks to their own devices. I love the way that nonprofits are positioned to be quite a bit more nimble than corporations, quite a bit more nimble than government, and they have access to communities and people in a way that other institutions don't. So I landed here by happenstance like many of us do, but what keeps me here is the ability to connect people from all backgrounds and facilitate conversations.
And you mentioned it a little bit, but what was there like a moment or something you wouldn't mind sharing about the transition from the work of development and being in the nonprofit world more directly versus being in that advisory role that you take on now?
Oh boy, that's another session. I have such a hot and cold relationship with fundraising. I would say it's hot in the sense that I've sat across from very well-meaning, well-to-do people who have just outright asked, how can I help? What do you need me to do? And I truly appreciate and value being able to be a trusted voice, right, in that conversation and help them determine what they're gonna do. But I also know how unsafe I felt in some of these conversations. I understand how someone's values were not aligned with mine, how much educating was actually required, how much money felt dirty, how much money didn't feel worth it. And so after a couple of years of that in a pandemic, I decided it was time to pivot. I reckon that I'm a much better truth teller than I am an actress. And there's only so much I could take as a chief development officer of painting a really pretty picture of a reality that was not that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of, just from my conversation with you, what you were facing is exactly this topic that we're taking on today, naming and addressing white supremacy and philanthropy. And before we get into this, April and I just wanted, we have a big group here today. There's almost 100 of you already on the call. And we realize this can be a sensitive conversation. And so we just wanted to put out a couple disclaimers for everybody coming into the space with us. And I would just say, you know, I'm nervous to have this conversation. And I think a lot of us, especially white people, it is really uncomfortable to talk about these things and use this language. And so, you know, I'm going to be doing my best. April might be calling me in if I say something that I could have said better. And I would just ask that everyone kind of appreciate that we're modeling in some ways how these conversations can be done so that we're having the conversation more. But I would caveat that April and I know each other pretty well. April's a professional racial equity practitioner. So I also wouldn't want any white people watching this to think that this is now like your invitation to go have this conversation with your Black coworker. Make sure that it's the right time, that you're doing your work, and that they're inviting the conversation too. So April, I don't know if you had any other kind of disclaimers you'd add before we jump in.
And we'll just gladly underscore the point about not walking up to any non-white people that you know boldly without having doing some pre-work or setting some other parameters and boundaries for the conversation and relationship that you have. A lot of that feels like free emotional, spiritual, intellectual, mental labor for your colleagues, and that's simply not fair. So while I'm encouraged that I hope have a very diverse crowd joining in, to Mitch's point, you don't want to just take some of this information and run with it. Really consider it your starting point if you're hearing it for the first time, but also understand that both Mitch and I need grace. We are all learning and unlearning inside of this work, and so I don't want to suggest that everything I say is gospel or Bible. I can certainly be challenged to, and I invite folks to do that so that we can learn together, because that's where the transformation happens.
Yeah, and as we're going, please jump into the chat, and you can toggle to message just hosts and panelists. So just April and I will see, and we can share if you had a specific question or story or example, or you can feel free to share with everyone. It's up to you, but we'd love input from the audience on just making sure we're addressing what's most relevant in your work, because we're going to talk through white supremacy kind of in general at a higher level, but also really trying to spend time on where it shows up in nonprofit work and philanthropy specifically. I'd love to start off to frame this conversation, April. Why is it so uncomfortable for people to talk about this?
Yeah, perfect way to start, and I have two answers. The first is really uncomfortable for who or for whom, because I don't have discomfort talking about this, even if I haven't done as much research and background, but I'm aware that white people are uncomfortable talking about this, right? And this is not specific to my generation. I'm reading a memoir by Lucille Clifton. If you all don't know who she is, look her up. And she explains in her memoir, she reaches out to the family who owned her family. And when she hears that the woman has like a concerned tone in her voice, she rushes to reassure her. Now that is outrageous and absurd, right? Like, you were owned by a family, legal or not, and your instinct is to comfort the other person. So I think we have to question who's uncomfortable and why, and whose comfort matters. But also the other reason that it is uncomfortable is because there's really a very complicated definition and background to white supremacy. So in reality and in fact, it is the system culturally, politically, economically, or otherwise in which white people control power, have power, hoard resources, but then it's also an idea, a belief that you don't have to buy into about white superiority. And so there's a lot smushed into this definition. The latter part of that about white superiority, I absolutely do not prescribe to. I don't believe you to prescribe to after we've been in conversation, but those things are mashed together inside of this. And so it speaks both to entitlement and it speaks to a system that is actually real, but just because it is doesn't mean it should be.
And how do we get over that discomfort that's showing up? Like, this conversation is a great example, but how do we get more people to be setting aside that discomfort and engaging in this kind of dialogue?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is accepting that everyone is learning at a different pace and in different ways, right? So miseducation, the miseducation that exists about white supremacy, about all of this language, a lot of which is polarizing, really just exists to maintain the racial hierarchy that we have. And so it was Nikki Giovanni that actually called out a couple of years ago, the language of white supremacy isn't helpful because it's not supreme. There's nothing supreme about it. And if people are immediately thinking about the superiority aspect, then we're not in the same conversation. Bell Hooks talks about whiteness and white supremacy as a state of unconsciousness, right? It's something that white people don't have to think about. It's just how they exist and move through the world. Whereas black people are very aware of other people's whiteness and the privileges that are afforded to them. So because it's treated as the default, you have to constantly remind folks or find ways to generally remind folks that there are other experiences happening. And in fact, there is a global majority that is not centering whiteness and need not center whiteness.
Yeah, and someone just messaged us directly in the chat saying what they see is this kind of rescuing that needs to happen, especially for white leadership. And it's quite problematic in the workplace for colleagues of color, especially in the nonprofit space, when that discomfort shows up. And one of the ways that I experience that too, and I think a lot of people who maybe the term white supremacy in this context is relatively new in the last few years, it's really easy to separate myself from that, right? To be like, oh, no, that's like the KKK, that's like the neo-Nazis, that has nothing to do with me. And creating that distance allows me, like you said, to like have more comfort. Why is it so important that we explicitly use that language in telling?
Yeah, because whiteness in and of itself is a construct, and it's a shapeshifter, and it's violent, and it's rooted in violence, and it's also fiction at the same time, right? If it's a construct, then that means it's not real. We just treat it as such. And there is no racism if we don't have this shared understanding and concept of whiteness. And so whether you want to say whiteness and dissect that or focus on white supremacy, it all rolls back to the same thing. And if that boundary always shifts for the protection of one group, then that means the freedom of everyone else is always going to be in question. So again, the foundation of any type of racism that we experience inside of the nonprofit sector, inside of our society at large, is sitting on top of whiteness. Racism has to have that as its starting point. And I too would not want to be in the company of people with my skin color who have done bad things, but we cannot take what is collective and true for groups at large and individualize and personalize them, right? It can still be true of a community, it can still be true of a lineage, of a history, even if it's not true for you, Mitch, personally. It's our collective responsibility to call these things out and respond accordingly.
Yeah, and something you brought up too about the white dominance and white supremacy being the root of how racism shows up. Why is it, just for people that are working to use the right language, like why is it correct to say white supremacy versus racism? And when is the right time to be referring to those two points?
I love this question because I don't actually think there is a right answer. And the reason there's not a right answer is because there's nothing but doublespeak and jargon in the sector in general, right? So even if you land on what the factual terms are, you're still gonna find yourself in conversation with someone else that disagrees or is approaching it differently, right? And I do this exercise with my clients, like helping them define what is equity? What are you talking about when you say power? What are you talking about when you say inclusion? And everybody's answers are all over the place. Or they're answers that are rooted in some kind of North Star, some kind of ambition. And that's just an ambition inside of a nation that has a heck of a lot of work to do to realize any of these principles, right? To actually be in a place that is equal, where freedom and access are available for all. So yes, educate yourself, I would say, on the terms, but understand that inside of every conversation you have to understand what that other person is referring to. So diversity is a fact, equity is a choice, inclusion is an action, belonging is a result. But that stuff is so interchangeable. Then we've thrown in access, and then we've thrown in all kinds of other terms just to really cloud it. And the same, I would say, is true of racism and of white supremacy. Depending on the audience and depending on the relationship, you have to figure out what language and terms to use. I personally focus on equity because if I can't get you to understand why you're choosing something, I'm never going to be able to affect your behavior short term or long term. It just won't stick. So that's what I focus on. White supremacy is a function of all of these things and is a factor, but I don't start conversations there because, again, like we started this conversation, it would not go very far. People are gonna shut down. And I wanted to say as well, it would be a privilege for a lot of non-white people to worry about saying the wrong thing, right? My discomfort is often linked to my safety, how safe I feel. The discomfort of a white person inside of these conversations is maybe not wanting to offend or just not wanting to opt into it in general. I don't have that privilege. If I offend you, fine, it's probably the least of my worry inside of a society that I know is particularly violent and aggressive towards Black people and communities of color.
Yeah, I just want to like reiterate and underline and underscore what you just said, because I think that's so powerful for someone. Back to our earlier question of how do we get folks over this discomfort, is like recognizing the privilege of your own discomfort and what's, you know, on the other side, whoever you're speaking with in that conversation. So thank you for lifting that up, because I just think that's so important.
Can I have one last thing? We're not going to define or term our way out of this. If that was the case, then the DEI model of old would have worked already. And many people, corporations, nonprofits, and otherwise have gone through a range of DEI days, DEI workshops, and they still don't come outside understanding whiteness or anti-Blackness or reparations any better, right? So sticking only to the terms, what we feel like the very buttoned up terms are and should be, is still just a very early starting point. You have to find other ways to penetrate what you see as the problem.
Yeah, thank you for reiterating that, because, you know, when we were planning this conversation, kind of intentionally, we're like, we don't want to spend an hour defining all of these terms. We want to hit on them and make sure people are grounded in the way we're using the language. But focusing on just getting the terminology perfect may even just be another reflection of elements of white supremacy culture and not actually making the change or having the conversation. So now that we've talked a bit about where this shows up in our society at large and some of the key terminology we're going to be using, what are some of the nuances about white supremacy and the need for equity in philanthropy and nonprofit work?
You know, and I know you know these stats, I believe it came out on last week's webinar, but the fact that 80% of board chairs and executive directors in the nonprofit sector are white should raise a lot of flags. People should be really, truly, deeply concerned by that. That 80% of the people that in large sense have the final say are white inside of a sector that we know is serving those who are marginalized or need access to certain programs. There's also a new stat that talks about the willingness of an organization to take a public action about racial equity. If that organization is Black or BIPOC led, it's 59% compared to 41% if these are white organizations or white led organizations. And I don't know how they're defining action about racial equity, but we know there's a lot of performance that happens, right? I would hope that the action is more than putting out a statement or posting a black square or doing something that doesn't actually hold you accountable to the community that you're serving. The other reality is that there are 60% of white-led organizations from fiscal year 21 that ended with a surplus, compared with 49% of Black-led organizations. So like the sector has a problem, and it's not that the sector doesn't do great work, but the sector has a problem. If you're in leadership and you are Black, you're going to face an uphill battle, and there have been countless Chronicle of Philanthropy articles, Forbes articles, you can look it up, about how being a person of color hinders how you can move up inside of this space. It also hinders how you can retain board members, how you can recruit board members. It's a culture thing, I think, specifically for employees, who gets credited for work, who is listened to, who is paid a respectable wage. We have a huge wage gap that we do not talk about. I'm getting ready to stay on my soapbox about any nonprofit claiming to be successful when the people that they're serving don't have health insurance. The people that work for them don't have health insurance and can't pay their bills. I'm sorry, you're not successful. That's not breaking even. That's not you being in the black. If the case managers, your program staff are a paycheck, a soda pop away from being one of their own clients, that is a problem. So it's about who has power. It's about who hoards it. And the stats I referenced earlier tells you who is in positions of power, and are those people actively sharing that decision-making power? Oftentimes not. So that's just some of the ways, large scale. We can talk a little bit more specific to donor and philanthropic relationships.
Yeah, I mean, just the representation there. I mean, someone, Michaela said in the chat how powerful and distressing those are. Why, I have so many questions to follow up on, but like, why is that so persistent? Like, do you have, I mean, aside from just because it's white supremacy, like, do you think there's anything specific about the sector that is keeping that status quo in place around representation and leadership?
You know, I'll say two things. And the first is, if there was an all black or minority board at a country club in any major city, there would be no members, right? We know that country clubs are notoriously and historically racist. But no one seems to have a problem when you have a racially homogenous board leading this black serving or minority serving organization. And there is a huge parallel there. But in terms of why, my attempt to answer that would be that we're okay with white people inside of the society telling communities what to do, right? Determining how much they will share, determining what solutions they will offer, and not inviting those people to the table. I mean, that is the structure. And anybody that has worked at a nonprofit knows just how scripted and performative our board meetings can be, our committee meetings can be. Who is that in service to? Like, what image are we trying to uphold and for whose sake? It's not for the people being served. It's to model after a corporate sector or another institutional organization that keeps people that we think have deep pockets close to us. That doesn't mean they understand the issue. It doesn't mean they're being educated. It doesn't mean that we're shifting their values. It just means they know they can go from one committee meeting to the next. So the why is a little bit more complicated to answer, but the what really should concern everybody, because I cringe when I see all white boards leading black serving organizations. I mean, it's tragic. And then you only invite the people being served into the conversation every 3 years when you need a new strategic plan, or when you need a site visit and you want them to smile because you're walking a certain donor through. You know, that's the structure that we're existing in, with white as the default, white as the donor, white as the leader, white as the board member. I have another example, a short story time. My team that I was managing when I was a chief development officer were all white women of different ages, some older than me, some younger. And a colleague and I, a member of my team, were out filming a video for a virtual event that we were having, very scrappy during the pandemic. A gentleman walked up to us. He was the CEO of the partner organization where we were. He looked at my colleague, a white woman, looked at me and began talking to her, and was just asking her why a certain member of our leadership team had left the organization. And I stepped in because that member was a colleague of mine. We were both chief officers at this organization. And he proceeded to look at me again and then continue the conversation with her. I mean, so there are countless examples of black EDs being bullied, you know, being left out of collaborations, being left out of collaboratives in general. And until we address like the leadership side of it, the governance piece, the staff side of it internally, you know, who's being elevated, who's being promoted, we have a very long way to go. I could keep going, and I think we will get there, specific to like donor relationships and marketing, but it's all the things, Mitch.
All the things. Yeah. I mean, just something you mentioned too about us, even assuming your donor base is the baseline is that it's white, and that can, like, you do this internal justification of practices that, you know, may not be as community centric or inclusive. I mean, I think what would be helpful for folks, because you've just done this where you've provided a really specific example, is I think we all understand that we're swimming in this ocean of racism in this country. Could we maybe talk through a couple of the most prominent ways that shows up within nonprofit work, and maybe give some examples? Because a lot of the questions we're even getting in the chat, and I got coming into this today, was like, what can I do when how do I identify this and make sure people see it with me? And I know one of the biggest areas that comes up a lot that I've seen is this concept of perfectionism and urgency. Do you mind talking for a little bit about the problems there, where that shows up?
Yeah, absolutely. So perfectionism makes it very difficult to be inclusive. It makes it difficult to be thoughtful, and it makes it difficult to identify lessons learned. And nonprofits are somewhat in a bind. I think somewhat we create and uphold it, and other times it is placed on those in the sector to get it right? Because you want to be a good steward of resources, you want to leverage X, Y, and Z. But in reality, inside of a nonprofit culture, it's when we treat inclusivity as an afterthought, right? As long as it looks good on paper and as long as it looks good, then we're doing the right thing. Well, then how can we grow and critique? And if we said earlier that the transformation happens through our inquiry, through our discomfort, through our learning and unlearning, then perfectionism is not going to be a good tool for that. But it does indeed exist, and it creates a culture of fear where people are afraid to try, they're afraid to propose new ideas and strategies. And urgency, similarly, is in service to what exactly, right? So to arbitrary funder deadlines, to appease schedules of board members, of leadership, of all these things that are external, that are not A, taking care of the people that are on the inside, or B, considering that we've created some of these systems, right? We're the ones that are in position to change it, but we want to rush through it and say, well, we didn't have time for DEI, we didn't have time for that. The reality is that you do, and you don't want to sort of flip everything on its head as you need to focus on equity and inclusion at the very beginning.
Yeah, and something you mentioned too, just about you're setting a standard that is unreachable for anyone, but especially if there is a person of color in that position who is not supported in all these other ways and has an unreachable standard, we're contributing to a position that feels like they're set up to fail by prioritizing.
Absolutely. And if we think about funder relationships too, how much of our funder relationships are just us repeating information, right? Like just us re-explaining, continuing to explain the same issue over and over again, and worried about very sort of small grammatical things that are not actually in service to that person understanding the larger context of the issue in a different sense. So it's happening inside between colleagues, but it's also happening with those external, volunteers and constituents as well.
And I think when a lot of people hear perfectionism or urgency pointed out as negatives of white supremacy culture, I think you can nod, like a lot of people will nod along and be like, oh yeah, that's bad. They deep down are thinking like, yeah, but like, it's good to try to be almost perfect, or like, yeah, but you got to get things done. And that's just like how the world works. When people are having those thoughts or get that response, if they try to engage with someone, what do you think is the right way to respond to that?
I feel like I'm a little cynical at this point in life, but it is true that people would respond that way. That we should always be. We should always be trying to improve, but where is there perfection inside of a nation that is as rife with social issues as ours, right? Like there is no utopia. There is no having figured it out. And even if you think you've reached some state of perfection, according to what? Like by whose standards? I don't want to, and I'll echo this again later, but I want to caution people again on having this conversation in spaces where they are not safe, or in spaces where the most important thing is that you take home your paycheck. So more than anything, you need to do due diligence to see if this is the fight and path you're going to take, because it's not always something that goes over well. If there is a culture of fear, if there is a culture of urgency, if there is a culture of perfection, it is not on one singular individual, white, black, or otherwise, to fix those things, nor is it your job. These are add-ons to your job description, right? So be very careful. I would just caution you on how much of this you want to take on. Granted, if you're invested in that mission, you're invested in that organization, then you want to make sure that you're building some support around you, because this truly is a different type of labor that will exhaust you in different ways that fundraising, which we know is exhausting, will not.
Yeah, thank you for flagging that too, because I think it's the safety, and this came up in a lot of pre-conversations I was having for this, where people wanted to know, like, okay, well, I see this problem in my organization, what can I do about it? And I love that as a first check of like, take care of yourself first and make sure that it's okay. And maybe a call to action for white folks on the line too, to do some of this work and likely be in a safer position because of the things we've talked about before. Another thing, especially when it comes to safety, and I know this comes up a ton, but that like conformist or professional culture and kind of like policing of tone, language, dress, how does that contribute to these challenges in nonprofit work?
Especially for fundraisers, and I know we probably have most fundraisers or folks that are in some sort of development seat joining us as well. It's really challenging. It's very problematic when there is a particular style of dress, or there is a particular style of communication that is preferred, or that we think is professional, we think of as professional, a hairstyle, a color code, a dress code. Again, that is not considerate of cultures, it's not considerate of other holidays, of religions, of different ways that people simply exist in the world and exist in community as well. So the culture piece and the conformist piece really does stifle creativity. I mean, I loathe having to make the business case for DEI, that's another conversation, but it stifles people from presenting new ideas, from thinking outside of the box if we're all trying to wear a string of pearls and a button up and a three-piece suit. I mean, that's just not the way that we connect, and we miss out on educational opportunities that way as well. But it does exist, and I think even in 2022, we would like to believe that we've reached a different place where respectability politics don't matter, but they do. And so many Black people coming out of the pandemic did not want to return to the office because they recognized how much freer they felt at home, not having to have someone comment on their hair, say something ridiculous about anything as it pertains to their physical person, and not wanting to use each one of those. Sometimes you just want to do your job, right? You just want to show up and not have to say, hey, no, I didn't grow my hair 18 inches overnight, but thank you so much for A, touching me without permission, and B, asking a question that you could have figured out on your own had you been a little bit more observant.
Yeah, thank you for sharing some of those examples. I'm sure it's even like hard to reflect on how frustrating those experiences can be. And this one really, as someone, for those in line, I worked at a big bank for 7 years. So like I've seen this professional conversation over and over again, and it's come up around people if they're too like flamboyant, as I'm a gay person, and that's come up in conversations before. When you're client facing, you have to act a certain way, and it's so similar, this like corporate culture that comes in to nonprofit work. Are there other ways that you find, like, I just keep putting corporate in air quotes, or professional, like how do those, when that intersects with nonprofit work, create more of these white supremacy related challenges for organizations?
For sure. So I mentioned earlier in terms of leadership, where we're hiring leadership from the corporate space sometimes to come inside of a nonprofit because we think that's the best thing. We don't look at the actual community. But then in terms of the culture itself, like, are the people all right is the question that I keep going to. Are the people okay? Have they stopped raising issues because they know they're not going to be listened to? Are they just showing up? Do you have a building of zombies just moving around that just can't wait to get through your all-staff meeting, that can't wait to get through whatever opportunities you have? I mean, if there's any business that you want to be in as a consultant, you probably want to be in culture change and change management, because there's a lot that nonprofits need. But it really does individually and collectively create the atmosphere, and it's palpable. I'm sure the financial institutions that you've worked at have a specific type of buzzing, right? Especially around, big achievements, etc. And nonprofits have that too. But more than anything, there's this culture of fear. There's this culture of, can we make it? Are we going to be okay? Are we doing right? And then development and funder-facing folks are always trying to explain that, yeah, we're doing a great job. No. So you have to be willing to show up and say, we've decided that our values are X, Y, and Z. We're going to be really transparent about this. We think we're falling short. Can you help us learn inside of this? And are you going to partner with us in this way? And be willing to hear some people say no. Be willing to have some people say, you're crazy and I don't want to talk to you. But it won't be everybody. It won't be everybody.
Yeah, and another thing that I think is definitely tied to corporate, which I feel like is also a word for competitive culture, is just like violence. You've mentioned this a few times, and it's probably worth just reiterating for everyone, like, where white supremacy stems from is a just thoroughly violent and exploitative culture that the country really was founded upon and built on. And we bring that into so many spaces and conversations with our own language. I would just love to hear you talk a little bit about how some of the words and expressions or things that we use can bring up that kind of violent culture, even within nonprofit work.
For sure. Whiteness and white supremacy was created to dominate. Like, it was created to shift, to protect itself, and to dominate. And nonprofits are not exempt from that. So if you have a predominantly white donor base, right? If you're only prospecting major donors or individual donors from white communities, then you have to assume you're going to have some type of disconnect with your mission work, right? And that's corporate or otherwise. But whiteness is violent in and of itself because it only protects itself. It doesn't even always protect white people. It's like it doesn't protect white women, it protects whiteness, and then it doesn't protect certain white men depending on where you find yourself. But it's going to protect itself. And so yes, that is a violent thing because it sort of it takes no prisoners, quite frankly. Mitch, I don't know how else to say it. And that's in our language. So whiteness wants to be both the savior, right? It wants to be the hero, but then it also wants to be the victim. Like, oh my gosh, I didn't know. You've chosen not to know. Like you've chosen a path of not knowing because you've opted out of difficult conversations. So much like you've opted into this with me, people opt out of the difficult conversations that they don't want to have. Or it sort of feigns ignorance, it feigns a lack of resources when you're inside of conversations with funders that say, oh, we can't, we never could, we shouldn't try, we can't take that risk. You can. It's up to you. You've chosen not to because you wrote your bylaws to say that you cannot. And so the violent thing to me about whiteness is the way A, that it only protects itself, and B, plays its power up and down. So however it wants to make it out of the scenario, if it wants to be the hero, if it wants to be the victim, it's going to have that binary and it's going to tell you which identity it's requiring you to take.
It's really powerful how you just sort of like animated whiteness and sort of like expressed its behavior and as like I don't know, personified, and I think that it will be helpful for people to think about it in a different lens if it's like separated from the individual people as like its own force, and it's just so powerful. And I mean, I even think about, I've caught myself saying things like, yeah, we're just coming in guns ablazing, or expressions like this that are just like, whoa, I don't need to bring that language into this space or this conversation, and just trying to be more thoughtful about where that language around violence comes up in so many ways too.
It's so true. And especially now, it took us over 100 something years to have Juneteenth recognized as a federal holiday, right? That says so much about where we are. So all of the good that's trying to happen inside of this sector is happening with the backdrop where the language and the conversation is so antiquated. We're only willing to have the same conversation over and over again instead of divorcing ourselves of that binary. Can America be both good and bad? Absolutely. Can the sector be both good and bad? Absolutely. And so whiteness sort of forces that on us, that it can only be the one thing, which is why nonprofits feel the way they feel about presenting this very pretty picture. But the reality is that there's a lot happening under the surface, and there's a lot of energy we expend to sort of hide that as well, or to divorce ourselves of the reality that it even exists. But I appreciate you calling out specific phrases that we all use. I know when I was working at a consulting firm, oh, it was just a very problematic environment, but the sales folks there, so the folks who were pitching clients and getting meetings to sell whatever partnership they wanted, they had some really interesting word choice. One was about like a kimono, and my friend and I would always be like, I haven't heard of this, and we would immediately Google it, and it was 9 times out of 10 always problematic. So not only are you comfortable saying that in front of us, in front of potential new business as well, and you're my superior, so I have to figure out a way to say, not only do I not want to hear it, but you shouldn't be saying it. Is there not other language that you can use to get your point across?
Yeah, I think there's this tendency to be like, oh, well, I can't say anything if someone tries to call out or point out something that could be problematic or triggering or traumatic for someone. And I would just encourage everyone listening to that's a gift when someone gives you that feedback. Like you said earlier, is your team not even complaining anymore? Right? Like it is a real gift when people are willing to give feedback to you as a person, to you as an organization. And I just would encourage everyone to receive that, ask for that, and action that as best they can.
It's a healthy response to be outraged by outrageous things, right? And if you are personally aware that there's something outrageous, inequitable, unfair happening inside of the organization where you work, and no one is outraged besides you, that is the biggest red flag, right? That tells you a lot you need to know about what's happening inside of that culture and how deeply things have permeated in. And then the other reality from your last comment is, of course, the old adage, he who owns the narrative owns the impact. And so that impact is twofold, though. You own the impact of what has happened, and you own the impact of what can happen, of what will happen.
Yeah, and there's been several comments coming into the chat, and encourage everyone to jump in there too, because we definitely want to make sure we get to them. And any examples or questions you have, would love to address in the last 18 minutes to got April on our, as we said at the beginning, 60 minutes to take down white supremacy. So we're doing our best. But a couple things that people have asked have been around, which sounds similar to what you just said. Like, I'm in an organization, I'm on this call right now. Like, I want us to do better, and I'm just one person. Like, how do I get started moving this conversation forward?
Yeah, I would encourage folks to figure out where their allies are, and I want to make sure that I'm very clear about allyship, because allyship is not something that you can dub yourself. Like, I can't say I'm now an ally of the LGBTQ community. I have to do something. I have to sacrifice something, and a lot of times you have people that are going to pay lip service but not actually put themselves in potentially harm's way or a difficult or uncomfortable conversation, as we mentioned earlier. So you need not be one person forging ahead. That is my bit of advice, coming from a place of self-care, coming from a place of knowing how expensive this work is, not just financially for folks that are relying on this position for their paycheck, but emotionally as well. So if you see, however, things that you want to change, and if this organization has values, illustrate the mismatch. You know, we say we value transparency, we say we value community, we say we value our employees. These lines are they're not crossing in the right place, right? And here are some things. But again, I don't push free labor on people. I promise you I don't. I just can't. But if you're asking for different ways to start, then calling the organization out, or at least inviting a conversation, that's a gentler way to say it, on the actual purported values that they have. Maybe the values simply need to be refreshed. Do these values make sense in 2022? Whatever it means to be inside of the 2020s, they've been a very strange couple of years for us in this country. But do these values make sense for us? What are we missing? When is the last time you talked to the community being served? When is the last time you thanked the community being served? We spend a lot of time thanking our donors for giving them another tax deduction. And that's not right. That's not the only way we can go about business.
Yeah, and another thing that came up from the perspective of a funder was saying, you know, what about the organizations we support where we would want to see more of this work happening? And I think funders are so often can, I think, as we discussed earlier, promote some of these cultures of urgency, perfectionism, et cetera, white savior, et cetera, paternalism. But how can they actually proactively help their grantees recenter away from those values?
So the question is specific to helping their nonprofit partners do more of this like equity type of work.
Yeah, like how can funders push this work forward?
Yeah, I would love more funders to ask, not of their nonprofit partners, you know, how are you going to sustain this grant? Tell me who hasn't approved you for support. Tell me, you know, who you've been trying to get in the doors with. And sometimes that happens inside of a partnership, but we don't really track that. You know, we don't really track it inside of a proposal or a report generally. Tell me where you can't get in the door, because it's going to illustrate who has simply just shut out issues, and not because there's not a funding alignment. You wouldn't be asking for the money ideally if there wasn't a funding alignment, but there's some other type of bias or relationship or issue at play. So how can you be of service to open the doors and shutter others in? In addition, offer wellness days, offer different things to support the actual people doing the work, right? Ask them specifically about their wage and funding gap. You know, I talked to a program officer who said they're going to stop increasing their support because the pandemic is over. We've had a number of pandemics at play at once, right? We have a lot of pandemics happening beyond this virus that is having its way globally. how good are the benefits? Like, how are people actually getting professional development? Oh, they're not. So there are myriad ways you can lend additional support and be proactive about that without requiring the organization to do additional work. Everything does not have to be a written document, a beautiful proposal. Quite frankly, there's a foundation in California, I don't want to attribute this to the wrong one, but they have abandoned all written proposals, all written reports. They call the nonprofit, have the conversation, their program officer takes all the notes, calls them back if they need additional information, and they submit it to their board. Which is what happens anyway, right? So how much busy work can you cut out? Like, you can still get to the information if you need it, but you've wasted a lot of time, especially in renewal type of conversations where you re-educate someone on the same thing every single year. This is still a problem, the community is still in poverty, we don't have access to food, and then you still give them another $30,000 check. That's not transformative support. That is not a trust-centered relationship.
Yeah, and I think that the examples you're giving around trust, having trust-based and trust-centered funding, I would just call out on Thursday, we were having an entire session just on trust philanthropy. So to the person who asked that question and others on the line interested either from a funding perspective or the grantee perspective, moving that forward, definitely tune into that. Another question that came up, which I think we can spend some time on this topic of donors specifically. The question was, how do we make naming and recognition for donors more equitable when the majority of our top donors are still white, and more specifically, older white men?
Yeah, fascinating question. Great question. Especially, I'm here in Ohio, and the richest man in Ohio is Les Wexner, who has, you know, very close ties to Jeffrey Epstein. There's a new documentary on, I want to say, Amazon Prime or Hulu about Victoria's Secret, which is one of the many sources of his money. And his name is all over Columbus. His name is all over some parts of the state as well. To make some of those things more equitable, you absolutely have to have very uncomfortable, difficult conversations. We're not honoring a lot of times the actual land that we're standing on. We're not honoring the actual, like I've said a million times, the people being served. We're not honoring the staff. So is a donor willing to forego their naming opportunity to celebrate the actual community that they exist inside of, the pond, if you will? See how I did that? But those are absolutely going to be challenging conversations. Yes, people want to have dialogue about the legacy of their families, the legacy of their own support, but if that has not been done in conjunction with the source of that person's wealth, then that's not maybe a conversation you want to be inside of, because then you're getting yourself into a difficult situation down the line. Or overall, naming and recognition opportunities in general just might not be how we want to dedicate some of the stewardship and cultivation that we do. It feels to me like a model of old. It's not entirely antiquated because it does raise a ton of money, but particularly for smaller nonprofit organizations, inviting that person to think about honoring someone else, making a statement as an organization that these are all the places, people, historical figures we want to honor. I know inside of my previous employer, there was just a wall of black and white images of white people, all the board chairs of the organization, in like a not so great community in Cleveland. What are you doing?
Yeah, and I think there's another kind of question behind that question too, of like why we don't have a very diverse donor base, so it doesn't feel like we're engaging as much of our community as we could into financial support of the organization. Do you have any advice for, I mean, recognition is good. That's how we start this conversation, naming, but how do we start to address some of those gaps within our supporter base?
Yeah, I'll shout out my coach, Rhea Wong, who's big on encouraging people to not think about donor diversity and donor wealth as, again, a binary. A lot of folks that are now in 2022 looking to diversify their pipeline or prospect pool are doing so after years of not considering that there were other resources elsewhere. So my advice is always to not try and just replicate your annual fund, your online campaign, and find the names of a bunch of Black people. That is your quickest path to tokenization. That is your quickest path to not actually building thoughtful relationships. But you need to spend a lot more time, figuring out, has there been harm done? Has there been, is there anything that we need to atone for or reconcile? And start the conversation there in ways that are actually sincere to you, not just to get in the door and get the money, but to understand why you're not in community with those folks in the first place, because you haven't thought about it, or because they don't want to be in community with you because they don't trust you for some reason. So it's not going to be the same sort of linear path where the people are in a routine of getting this letter and sending you a gift in December. No, you've got to understand, who do they trust? And how can you invest in who the community trusts and uplift that person, and leverage the support in that way? You have to sacrifice something as well if you want doors to open for you that you've otherwise closed.
Yeah, and I something you mentioned too, that false dichotomy, I think is so important, to not, you're like making this assumption that there isn't, large wealth to be donated within all kinds of communities. And that's what you're shutting yourself out from. And I think a lot of these conversations we've been having this month and going forward around like better practices for your community is not in exchange for raising less money. Like, it's all at the goal of like growing and sustaining your organization, but just doing it responsibly and sustainably.
Absolutely. And if you're late to the party, then you're late to the party. I mean, that's where you're starting. You're in good company. You're in good company. I had a rough conversation with a board that I'm on. Someone asked me for my annual donation. I know there's a give get. They're like, I'm really sorry to have to ask you. And I was like, how often do you say that to other people? Like, what are you sorry to have to ask me for? So it's just there, again, abundance of grace, but people are just really not aware of their language, and how it's going to be choppy until you get more experience under your belt of existing inside of that conversation and really being a listener.
Yeah, and in the last few minutes here, I'd love to just really focus on that addressing component of the conversation, and talk through, and you mentioned this way back at the beginning about kind of like checking your own safety in the circumstance. And you gave an example of like maybe asked to have a conversation about equity instead of using the language of white supremacy to get someone started, if that helps with your own safety as a person of color. Any other thoughts on I had several people ask me this beforehand. They were like, I see an issue and I really want to bring it up. And I know I'm going to have an uncomfortable conversation. Just like practically getting started, do you share resources first and then talk to them, or point them at this webinar recording afterwards and then talk to them afterwards?
Sure, I've tried it myriad ways. I've sent articles in advance and asked to use that as a talking point. I haven't shared podcasts, but that's another great strategy. Simply trying to add it to the agenda, but I can't underscore enough how important it is that you have taken care of yourself and making sure it's something that you're passionate about. Just because you see an issue doesn't mean the organization is going to be primed to change. Some folks just are not ready, and I don't mean to sound cynical or like there is a lost cause, but some organizations are not ready and they need something else to happen. They need some other type of jolt to hit them before they are. I don't want to suggest, again, that your words are not strong enough or impactful enough, but I do want you to be careful and take care of yourself, trying to force people to learn or unlearn at speeds that they don't have. I do know one particular model, if an organization's leadership is part of the issue. There's like a growing movement or trend of nonprofit EDs asking to be evaluated at a certain, maybe like every 5 years, 3 years, see if they're still the right person for the job, and to be evaluated on that because the context that they're in has changed. And so that is part of the individualism that we didn't talk about earlier. It takes a certain type of leader to want to do that. But if you're in an environment where someone is hoarding power, where someone is controlling a narrative, it's not just that you can try one thing, you have to try multiple things. And I would suggest you try multiple things in community. Maybe you can find a funder that is willing to sort of partner with you and help shift the tide. But you're going to have to be prepared for a messy journey regardless. Even when people do want to learn and they are ready to start addressing some of these things, again, looking at your value alignment and seeing how things maybe don't align, that's a great place, some way to make it tactile and tangible. When's the last time that there was a staff survey? When's the last time that there was any type of inquiry into how people are doing? When's the last time you looked at retention rates? Culture, morale, all of those things that you can measure in some way. And whether you tie that directly to white supremacy with a hard line is ultimately up to you, but you can still tie it to something that needs to be changed and something that needs to be attempted or tried to do differently.
Yeah, and it feels like you mentioned this earlier about allies, and maybe there is someone else in the organization who, if it's more safe for them to bring it up, maybe you can ask for their help in addressing it and having that kind of, not to gang up on someone. I feel like people never tend to not get defensive, which is another definite like white supremacy culture trait, but that sort of strength in numbers might help from the safety perspective too.
It's not an ambush, but you certainly want your organization to be on the right side of history. You want your organization to be prepared the next time something happens in the public mainstream that forces everyone's attention, much like happened in 2020, and not be caught off guard again and not have to look up and say, oh yeah, that DEI committee that's now defunct, or that statement that we never actually lived out. You have to figure out ways to live these things out when it's unpopular to do so, and when it seems like you get downtime. You technically don't. You don't.
Yeah. And I think it also, you brought up kind of performative, and this came up in the chat a few times too, of like, what if someone they responded to your request, or you've talked about it and they committed to doing something and it's just kind of falling flat? Like, how do you know when something is just performative, and what are the best ways to address that, like performatively addressing equity issues but not having the impact?
Yeah. The question, I think, for me is always, did it cost you anything? Did you have to sacrifice anything? Your performance, your statement, your words of support are nice and helpful, and people want to hear them to understand. But what have you actually and factually changed about how you do business? To be an ally, to actively be in community with someone, you have to be willing to say, I'm going to stand on this pillar and I'm not going to shift even when I'm tired and it gets uncomfortable. And so a lot of the performance we see does not do that. A lot of the performance is just lip service. And so what is the evidence of your performance? Like, where's the actual support that says, this is all the things we did, this is what we tried differently, we weren't successful, but we're willing to learn. And to be willing to learn, you have to break through the perfectionism that we talked about earlier.
All right, well, we've covered as much as we could here in 59 minutes. This has been so jam-packed with incredible guidance, words of wisdom, examples. Thank you so much to everyone in the audience for contributing so many great questions. This is the beginning, I think, for everyone here, hopefully, of more and more of these conversations and dialogue. We hope to do more of it here at Pond. So big heartfelt thank you to April for joining us and sharing so much of this. Has just been incredible. This will be recorded. A lot of people had asked me, this will be recorded and available on Pond after the fact. If you registered, we will send you an email when that's up and available. And just be sure to check out, like I mentioned, upcoming sessions and all the other ways you can use Pond to be finding great vendors, consultants, software. We're here to match you with everyone and make it super, super simple. So thank you so much, April.
Thanks, Mitch. Thanks, everyone.